Welcome to this brief presentation on reimagining leadership theory, a cognitive process model of leadership. I want to share this model with you because I found it to be tremendously helpful in my own work. This model grew out of my work that I do in international leadership development. A number of years ago, I was invited to present at a conference in Cusco, Peru, and I was presenting a full-day workshop on servant leadership. And so I went down and I gave this full day workshop, and I felt really good about it. And people were coming up to me afterwards and telling me how much they appreciated it. And then one of those individuals said something to me that kind of changed the way I thought about the work that I do. They said, "Jeff, this presentation was wonderful. Thank you so much. You must have the best leaders in the United States." Now, as you can imagine, that is laughable in many ways, but at the same time, it was deeply tragic for me because I realized that what I had just done was engage in a form of cultural imperialism. I had brought an idealistic, prescriptive, culture-bound model of servant leadership to another country and presented it as if it was something that was really being enacted. And I think for anybody who's familiar with servant leadership, we know that it's an idealistic model. We know that it's not something that you achieve. Robert Greenleaf even himself suggested that it was something to aspire to. But that point had been missed. And because it had been missed, I had really made a fundamental error in the work that I was doing. And it made me stop and think, how can I approach this in a way that's more flexible, that is not going to impose models on others? And I think this challenge of bringing leadership theory and doing leadership development work in international context really emerges from the history of leadership theory. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this, so I'll be very, very brief, but we all know that much of leadership theory emerged from the great man idea. This idea that leadership is based on the work of great men, and that as a result, we needed to find those great men and put them into positions of leadership. And so this led to a search for traits or styles and behaviors that would reflect that great man approach to leadership, that would identify who these leaders were, or at least tell them how to lead so that they could be these great men. That gave birth to these contingency theories, trying to identify the one right way to lead using these different models, and ultimately led to many of the contemporary models that we see today: servant leadership, transformational leadership, charismatic leadership. Now, I'm not trying to criticize those models necessarily, because I think they have their place and I think they're very, very valuable, and the research has demonstrated that. But there are some limitations when we start to take those into a broader context. But also there are some limitations in terms of the way they cause us to think about leadership. As we look at where leadership theory is going today, the move is more towards a complex systems understanding of leadership, moving away from the idea as leadership is situated in the individual and more as situated in the complex systemic relationship between the leader, the follower, and the context, and how that relationship results in emergent forms of leadership that are momentary in nature. I like to think of it this way, that leadership is what emerges in the moment as the leader and the follower divorced from the idea of position, because the one influencing and the one receiving influence is not necessarily positional and is not necessarily static. I may be striving to influence someone as they are mutually striving to influence me. And so we're engaging in this process of influence that's mutual in nature, but where leadership shifts back and forth between the leader and the follower in that process. Nonetheless, if we think of a moment in time where a leader is influencing the follower based on the goal that the leader has and building a relationship that out of which emerges a form of influence that's taking place. but that form of influence may shift and change in the next moment and the next moment and the next moment. And so the nature of this interaction both forms the style and approach of the leader over time, as well as the style and approach of leadership that emerges between this leader and follower over time. Within a broader context, those moments of leadership create the culture of the organization or the group or the society as leadership continues to emerge from moment to moment. This way of thinking about leadership changes the way that we perceive leadership in a fundamental way. It suggests that rather than the great man theory of leadership being what a leader does, and therefore we need to identify the right way to lead and prescribe that to others based on some idealistic paradigm that is often culture bound and supposed to remain constant. In other words, leaders tend to think of themselves as, I'm a servant leader. Even though in reality, we all know that in some moments, yes, we do practice perhaps servant leadership or transformational leadership. But in other moments, we can be pretty autocratic, commanding, and even manipulative. And so we need to shift the way we think about leadership. And this complex systems perspective is changing that as we recognize that our leadership is variable from moment to moment, and that what emerges in the interaction is what leadership is. Not what the leader does necessarily, but what emerges between the leader and the follower and the complex relationship in which they're involved. This would then require us to think about leadership as more descriptive, describing what's emerging, and practical, coming up with ways to influence what emerges in a way that's practical. But also this suggests that leadership is more culturally flexible, and we need models that are culturally flexible. So as I thought about this, and I thought about my experience in Peru, I was thinking about what is constant about leadership? What is consistent in these leadership moments? And I realized that all human beings who are engaged in leadership moments have a brain. Sometimes we may wonder whether or not leaders use them, but they have them. And then as I studied the brain, I realized that there's a lot of research out there suggesting that while the content of the mind is variable and culturally dependent, in other words, what I pay attention to in making decisions varies from context to context based on my culture. The fact that I have to be aware of information, determine where to focus my attention, and then based on that awareness and that attention make decisions is constant across cultures because it's based in the human anatomy of the brain. All human brains have some basic cognitive processes that remain constant, even though the contents that shape those processes vary. Consider the following example. You have an ambassador from the US and an ambassador from China who come together to mutually influence one another. As they're influencing one another, each one steps into the moment with some awareness of the past interactions and the past knowledge that's important to that moment. They're also aware of what's going on in the moment as they are engaged in influencing one another. All of this awareness shapes their attention and what they're attending to individually as they interact with one another. And then they make decisions about how they want to interact and how they want to try to capture, direct, and maintain the attention of the other. They then engage in actions and processes of influence to try to accomplish the goals that they have in the moment. All of this takes place as they engage with one another via communication processes. So it's that communication that allows them to capture, direct, and maintain the attention of the other. As they do that, they develop and form a relationship that becomes the foundation for influence in the moment and influence in the future. And so these basic principles represent the cognitive processes that take place in these leadership moments. However, it's important to be aware that while these principles of awareness, attention, decision-making, relationship, communication, and then action are constant regardless of the moment, the processes that we use in that moment, the skills that we use, may vary depending upon the level of interaction that's taking place. The example I just gave you is an interpersonal level interaction as two individuals engage with one another. And here they're using skills or actions, processes associated with negotiation. But if that interpersonal interaction was a supervisor influencing their own employee, they would still have to be aware of what's going on in the moment, managing their own attention, capturing, directing, maintaining the attention of the other, making decisions, building a relationship, and communicating. Those would remain constant. But the skills they would be employing may be more coaching-oriented or conflict resolution-oriented, as opposed to just negotiation. Although there may be some negotiation going on there as well. But think about this, because if I'm just leading myself, the principles of awareness, attention, decision-making, relationship, and communication are still present, even if the actions are different, as I'm doing this through mindfulness and other perhaps spirituality developing processes or other things. At the group level, if I'm conducting a meeting, I've still got to be aware of what's going on in myself, my followers, and the context. I've got to manage my own attention and capture, direct, and maintain the attention of others. I've got to both engage in decision-making and facilitate decision-making as I build relationships and communicate with the individuals that I'm leading in that group context. But the actions, the processes and actions that I take will vary based on the need to facilitate the meeting or conduct the meeting. And so while the principles remain constant regardless of the moment at which we're leading, the processes and actions that we take will vary. Think about it this way. There are certain competencies that are essential to those principles. Awareness requires that we be effective at listening, environmental scanning, and managing our own self-awareness. Relationship building requires that we understand trust building and relationship development, and some of the constant elements of those, even if they vary from culture to culture in terms of what's important to trust building. And so there are essential competencies that we need to help leaders to develop for any moment in which they find themselves. But at the same time, there are competencies that are moment specific. And so a leader, depending on the level at which they generally lead, will apply these competencies in different ways. For example, at the group and team level, we're looking at team development, conducting effective meetings, whereas at the interpersonal level, coaching and motivating others would be key competencies. This model has been tremendously beneficial for me in my work. As I returned to Peru, I took a different approach. Instead of coming in and saying, this is what leaders should do, I came in and said, when you're in your leadership moments, you need to be aware of what's going on around you. And then we talked about the principle of awareness and what we need to be aware of. And we engaged in dialogue where they shared with me the things that they need to be aware of in their context and how they can capture, direct, and maintain the attention of their followers based on their cultural understanding. We talked about basic principles of effective communication, but then how those principles are applied differently in their context. We also talked about basic principles of human relationship formation, but how they build relationships differently in their own cultural context. I found it tremendously rewarding and insightful for me, and since then have applied this model to the leadership work that I've done in Germany, in the United States, in Latin America, and I found it to be tremendously beneficial, and I hope that it is for you as well. I appreciate the opportunity again to share this presentation and hope you found it beneficial.